We've spent the last several videos looking at the institutional grammar in detail. We explored the evolution from IG 1.0 to IG 2.0, and we reviewed the features associated with each of the three levels of expressiveness in the institutional grammar 2.0: IG Core, IG Extended, and IG Logico. After much study, you now feel ready to do institutional analysis with the institutional grammar. So how exactly do you go about applying the institutional grammar? In this video, we'll go over some basic coding pragmatics and show you what coding at the different levels of expressiveness looks like. We can divide the process of institutional grammar coding into three steps: planning, execution, and assessment. The planning stage involves figuring out what your coding is going to look like. First things first, you need to identify and collect your institutional data. Institutional data refers to data that is captured in institutions as they exist in a particular domain. Once that data is coded, it becomes institutional information. What your institutional data looks like will depend on the kinds of institutions that you're studying. If you're studying a formal institution, chances are that you'll be dealing with written policies and other related documents, such as memos. On the other hand, if you're studying an informal institution, then you might instead rely on interview transcripts. The nature of your institutional data will, in turn, impact how you go about collecting it. Data on formal institutions will probably require research at archives, libraries, and/or online databases, while informal institutions may require conducting interviews or gathering transcripts and notes of interviews done by others. As you're collecting your institutional data, it is important to appropriately scope it as well. In other words, you need to have a good idea of what institution you're studying, what aspect or aspects you want to look at, and exactly how much data you need to collect. All of this will depend on the research questions that you're trying to answer. Once you've gathered your institutional data, you then need to decide which tools you're going to use to turn your data into information. Many analysts who use the institutional grammar use spreadsheet software like Microsoft Excel to input their coded institutional statements, with each row representing a single institutional statement and each column corresponding to a syntactic component. Here's an example of what that looks like. In addition, dedicated software has been developed to allow for the tagging of institutional statement components, including the IG parser. We'll look at an example of coding with the IG parser later in this video. Next, you'll need to figure out which level or levels of expressiveness you intend to use, as well as the features of those levels that you're interested in studying. Here, it's worth reiterating certain aspects of the levels of expressiveness that we discussed in prior videos. First, the levels of expressiveness are not mutually exclusive. You can code for certain features from one level of expressiveness, while also coding for features from another level. Second, the levels of expressiveness are not all or nothing. You can code for some features while disregarding others. If, for example, your research was particularly interested in the context component, you could apply the context taxonomy from IG Extended without also having to engage with the property typology. Finally, the levels of expressiveness are backward compatible. This means that if you're coding at the IG Extended or IG Logico level, you have the option to shift back to a lower level of expressiveness. As you conclude the planning stage, you should decide how closely you want your institutional information to match your institutional data. Sometimes certain components will not appear in an institutional statement, but will instead be inferred or implied. This often happens with the attributes. When turning data into information, you may want to make that component explicit. You may also decide to make stylistic changes to your data, for instance, turning plural words into singular, or removing prepositions like a and the. Lastly, you'll want to decide who will be involved in the coding process, if it will be just you or a team of people, and if the latter, what their respective backgrounds and strengths are. Once you've made all your necessary preparations, it's time to move on to the execution stage. There are a few things you'll want to do before you start coding your institutional data. First, you should review the data you're coding, whether that's policy documents or transcripts and notes, to make sure that you have a general understanding of the institution you're studying. You will also want to pre-process your institutional data. Pre-processing involves reworking your institutional data so that it is easier to code. Not every sentence that appears in a policy text or an interview is necessarily an institutional statement. Indeed, single sentences may contain multiple unique institutional statements. In the case of interviews, there may be few, if any, complete institutional statements, and interviewees may speak in ways that leave important details unsaid. Regardless of the form that your institutional data takes, you may find that you need to modify statements so that they conform to the syntax of regulative and constitutive statements, which might involve adding, removing, and/or rearranging words, clauses, or punctuations. Regardless of whether your institutional statements are pre-processed or organic, you should confirm that they have the necessary components corresponding to the two main institutional statement types. All regulative statements should have an attributes, aim, and context, while all constitutive statements should have a constituted entity, constitutive function, and context. During this verification, it may be useful to categorize your institutional statements as regulative or constitutive, or if applicable, as hybrid or polymorphic. This can sometimes prove harder than it sounds. Here are some pointers to keep in mind for each statement type. Regulative statements provide behavioral guidance to an actor or group of actors who may be explicitly named or implied. It specifies whether the behavior in question is optional or required, and it may also identify consequences that result if behavior is not carried out. Constitutive statements, on the other hand, will introduce or otherwise define aspects of a system. For instance, it may establish an entity or a position that someone can hold. It may define something. It may confer rights, responsibilities, or authority, or it may set out boundaries. Once you've prepared your institutional data, you can begin coding. The Institutional Grammar 2.0 provides a script associated with the different features of each level of expressiveness that you can use to annotate your institutional statements as you code. We will not go over the entire IG script here. However, Section 4 of the Institutional Grammar 2.0 Codebook contains a comprehensive guide to the IG script. If you scan the QR code or navigate to the link shown on the screen, you can consult the script as we proceed through the rest of this video. To give an example of what coding with the IG script looks like, let's look at an example institutional statement and code it according to all three levels of expressiveness. Consider the following statement. A joint office of energy and transportation to study, plan, coordinate, and implement joint issues shall be shared between the U.S. Department of Transportation and the U.S. Department of Energy. The first thing to note about this statement is that it's a constitutive statement. We know this because it's constituting a new entity, the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, in the institutional domain. Here's what that statement looks like when coded according to IG core. The Joint Office of Energy and Transportation is the constituted entity. The phrase to study, plan, coordinate, and implement joint issues is a property of that constituted entity. Shall is the modal. Be shared is the constitutive function, as it represents the function of sharing. Between represents an execution constraint, since it is qualifying the nature of the sharing. And the U.S. Department of Transportation and the U.S. Department of Energy represents an additional property. While coding, we've introduced ORs into the constituted entity properties to express the different activities in which the joint office may be engaged at any given time. We don't use an AND annotation, as that would imply that the joint office was performing all these activities simultaneously. We've also removed articles like a and the. We've also added under all circumstances as an implied activation condition. This is not strictly necessary in this case, since the institutional statement already has an explicit execution constraint. However, if a statement doesn't have an explicit activation condition or execution constraint, then you may insert either under all circumstances to express an activation condition, or without any constraints to express an execution constraint. True to IG core, this is a basic breakdown of the institutional statement, and there's room to refine some of these components further. Here's what the coding of the statement looks like under IG extended. As you may notice, the coding has changed in some important ways from our IG core coding. That is because, when looking at the statement through the lens of IG extended, we can see that our example statement can actually be decomposed into two institutional statements. One in which the Joint Office is tasked with specific responsibilities. The Joint Office of Energy and Transportation shall study, plan, coordinate, and implement joint issues, and another that outlines the departments that will share the Joint Office. The Joint Office of Energy and Transportation shall be shared between the U.S. Department of Transportation and the U.S. Department of Energy. Accordingly, whereas to study, plan, coordinate, and implement joint issues was previously a constituted entity property, study, plan, coordinate, and implement are now the constitutive function, with joint issues being a property. The rest of the coding remains the same, except for the inclusion of the context taxonomy, one of the features introduced as part of IG extended. In our example, between represents procedural context, so we include the annotation MET to indicate that the context is describing a method by which the sharing will occur. Finally, we get to the IG logical coding. We can apply our IG logical coding one of two ways. We can either go straight from IG core to IG logical, or we can iterate on our IG extended coding. Because our IG core and IG extended codings look so different from each other, it's useful to see what both codings look like. Here is the IG logical coding if we start from the IG core level. Here we've incorporated all four of the taxonomies introduced under IG logical: animacy, metatype, role, and in this case, constitutive functions. Our constituted entity is animate, concrete, and a recipient. For the constitutive functions taxonomy, being shared establishes a relationship among the Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy, and the Joint Office. The Departments of Transportation and Energy, meanwhile, can be labeled as animate, concrete, and possessors. And here is the IG logical coding if we build off the IG extended coding. The annotations for the Joint Office and the departments remain the same, as does our annotation for be shared. Since joint issues is now a property, we can annotate it as inanimate, concrete, and experiencer. As for study, plan, coordinate, and implement, we can define it as an intent according to the constitutive functions taxonomy. Earlier in the video, we mentioned different tools available for capturing institutional information, like spreadsheets. Here we will demonstrate one tool specifically developed for analysts using the institutional grammar called the IG parser. IG parser is a tool that parses institutional information in the IG script notation. A user will input an institutional statement coded according to IG script, and the parser will generate an output in one of two forms. The parser can generate a spreadsheet table like what we discussed previously, or a tree that displays the data visually. The tree output can help better highlight the linkages between and among different words and components. Here's what the parser looks like. You paste your coded statement here, adjust your parameters as needed, and then click Generate Visual Output. Here's the IG core, IG extended, and IG logical codings of our statement represented as tree outputs. parser is also useful for checking your coding. The parser will generate error messages if, for instance, you have the wrong number of parentheses. Additionally, the tree output lets you see if something doesn't quite look right. If components aren't linked the way you would expect them to be, this may be a sign that you need to revisit your coding. If you want to generate a tabular output for your coded statement, you can do so in one of two ways. If you're already on the visual output screen, you can simply click Switch to Tabular Version of IG Parser, and then generate the output. Or you can navigate to the Tabular Output screen. After you've completed your coding, you can move on to the assessment stage. At this stage, you'll want to verify that you've captured your institutional information correctly. For that, you'll want to perform intercoder reliability testing. This involves enlisting other coders, typically 2 per institutional dataset, to code a portion of your data to see how closely your respective codings line up. For IG coding, you'll want your test coders to code about 10 to 20% of your data. If there's at least 80% agreement between you and your test coders, you should be good to go. Make sure your test coders are familiar with the institutional grammar, the institution under study, and how you went about your coding. If you find that your coding is slow going when you're first starting out, don't get frustrated or discouraged. Becoming proficient at coding with the IG 2.0 takes time. Even expert coders will disagree amongst themselves about how to label different syntactic components. The IGRI has a wide array of tools and resources available to beginner coders, including codebooks, reference guides, sample spreadsheets, software, and an annual virtual training on the fundamentals of the institutional grammar. All this and more are available on our website, institutionalgrammar.org.